Keanu Reeves stepped out of the sleek black car, his polished boots pressing onto the pavement. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of autumn leaves and faint nostalgia. He hadn't been here in years, his old high school standing just as he remembered, yet feeling like a distant memory. The grand entrance, the familiar brick walls, the tall windows reflecting the golden afternoon light. It was like stepping into a time capsule. He adjusted his jacket, taking in a slow breath. This wasn't just a casual visit. A high-profile fundraiser for underprivileged students had brought him back. The school board had invited him as a guest of honor, an alumnus who had made it big. But as he stood there, looking at the building that had once been his entire world, something felt off. His fingers instinctively curled into his pockets as he made his way inside. The hallways were quieter now, only a few distant voices echoing through the corridors. The faint scent of old textbooks and freshly waxed floors hit him, triggering a flood of memories. The sound of slamming lockers, the hurried footsteps of late students, the hushed whispers of teenage secrets, all of it played in his mind like an old film reel, but then something pulled him out of his thoughts. A figure moved at the far end of the hallway. Slow, deliberate. A mop gliding across the tiled floor, a bucket rolling softly beside it. Keanu's steps faltered, his eyes narrowed slightly. There was something eerily familiar about that posture, the way the man held the mop, the rhythm of his movements. His breath hitched for a split second. It couldn't be. His boots clicked against the floor as he walked closer. The fluorescent light flickered overhead, casting shifting shadows across the walls. And then, the old man turned. Keanu's breath caught. The face staring back at him was worn by time, lined with deep creases, hair completely white. The uniform was clean but visibly aged, the fabric stretched thin over bony shoulders. But it was the eyes, tired, yet still carrying a flicker of warmth, that confirmed it. Mr. Alves, the janitor from his teenage years. The quiet man who had been nothing more than a background presence to most students, but to Keanu, he had been something else. A rush of emotions hit him all at once, nostalgia, disbelief, and an unsettling feeling creeping into his gut. Why was he still here? Keanu took a hesitant step forward. "Mr. Alves?" The old man blinked, his tired gaze trying to focus. For a brief moment there was no recognition, just polite, professional acknowledgement, and then it clicked. His weathered face shifted, something unreadable passing through his expression. "Keanu?" His voice was rough, worn down by time, yet still carrying a familiar warmth. Keanu let out a small, incredulous laugh. "It's been a long time." Mr. Alves gave a slow nod, his gaze scanning Keanu as if seeing the past and present collide. "A very long time." A pause, thick with unspoken words, with the weight of time. Keanu swallowed, his mind racing. He had come here expecting a nostalgic walk through his past, a few handshakes, maybe a speech at the fundraiser. But instead, he had stumbled upon a mystery that refused to be ignored. Keanu's eyes lingered on the janitor's uniform, the old name tag pinned to his chest, the slightly hunched posture. A strange unease settled in his stomach. Mr. Alves had already been an older man when Keanu was a teenager. How was he still working here, pushing a mop down these same hallways? His throat felt dry as he spoke. "I never expected to find you here." Mr. Alves chuckled, shaking his head. "I never left." The words were said lightly, but something about the way he said them made Keanu's stomach twist. His gaze flickered to the mop bucket, the wet floor, the worn-down shoes. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. Mr. Alves was still working, not as a guest, not as a volunteer. He was still scrubbing these floors, still cleaning up after students who didn't know his name, at 80 years old. Keanu forced a smile, though something deep inside him was stirring. "Full time?" The old man hesitated, just for a second. Then he nodded. "Work keeps me moving, you know how it is." Keanu narrowed his eyes slightly. That wasn't an answer, that was avoidance. His mind raced, taking in the subtle details he had overlooked before. The slight tremble in Mr. Alves's fingers, the stiffness in his walk, the way he shifted his weight onto one leg as if trying to ease some unseen pain. The exhaustion wasn't just in his body, it was in his eyes. How many years had he been doing this? How many late nights, early mornings? How many empty hallways had he walked alone, forgotten by the very place he had spent his life serving? Keanu felt a wave of unease crawl up his spine. This wasn't just a job. This was survival. His jaw tightened. The school was hosting a fundraiser tonight, raising thousands of dollars for underprivileged students. And yet, the man who had spent decades keeping this place running was still here, pushing a mop at 80. Something wasn't right. Keanu exhaled slowly, trying to keep his voice light. "You've been here a long time, Mr. Alves. A lifetime." The janitor smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. Keanu hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Why are you still working here?" The question hung in the air. Mr. Alves' smile faltered, just for a fraction of a second. A shadow crossed his face, barely noticeable, but Keanu saw it. And in that hesitation, he had his answer. Mr. Alves was hiding something. That hesitation, it wasn't just fatigue, it was something deeper, something Mr. Alves wasn't saying. Keanu recognized it instantly. A man doesn't work until 80 unless he has no choice. The silence between them stretched, thick with unspoken truths. Mr. Alves looked away first, gripping the mop handle a little tighter. Keanu had seen that kind of grip before, the kind that held on because letting go wasn't an option. Keanu took a slow breath. "Mr. Alves." He kept his voice even, careful. "Are you okay?" The old janitor let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. "Now why would you ask me a thing like that?" Keanu didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced around, the empty hallway, the flickering overhead lights, the long stretch of tile that Mr. Alves had probably cleaned 1,000 times over. This wasn't right. Keanu crossed his arms. "You always told me the truth when I was younger." His voice was softer now, familiar. "Told me I wasn't invisible, even when I felt like I was." That made Mr. Alves pause, just for a moment. Keanu studied him, waiting. "So tell me the truth now." The old man exhaled, rolling his shoulders as if shaking off an invisible weight. Then, finally, he sighed. "You don't need to worry about an old janitor like me, son." Wrong answer. Keanu felt frustration prick at the back of his mind. He had spent years reading people, understanding them. He knew when someone was holding back. His gaze dropped to Mr. Alves' hands again. The slow, steady tremor, the way he shifted his weight off one knee like it ached. There was more to this than he was admitting. Keanu's voice dropped lower. "You don't have to pretend." A beat of silence. Then finally, a crack in the armor. Mr. Alves exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. "Keanu." He shook his head, a tired smile tugging at his lips. "You always were a stubborn one." Keanu didn't move. He just waited. Another sigh. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, Mr. Alves finally said it. "Because I have no choice." Keanu's stomach tightened. Mr. Alves gave a half shrug like it was nothing, like it was normal for an 80-year-old man to be scrubbing floors just to survive. "My pension isn't enough," he admitted. "Worked my whole life, but what I get each month barely covers rent and food, and with the cost of living..." He trailed off, chuckling bitterly. "Well, you know how it goes." Keanu clenched his jaw. "How long?" His voice was quieter now. Mr. Alves glanced at him. Keanu swallowed hard. "How long have you been struggling like this?" The janitor gave a small, tired smile. "Long enough." And just like that, everything shifted. Keanu had spent years in Hollywood, surrounded by luxury, by people who threw money away on things they didn't need. And yet, here was a man who had dedicated his life to helping others, and had been forgotten by the very place he had served. It wasn't just unfair. It was unacceptable. Keanu took a slow breath, steadying the anger rising in his chest. This wasn't going to be one of those moments where he simply walked away. Something had to change. Keanu didn't say anything at first. He just stood there, his jaw tight, his mind racing. Mr. Alves had spent his whole life in these hallways, watching over kids, keeping the school running, giving everything he had. And now, in the years he should have been resting, he was still fighting just to survive. It wasn't right. It wasn't fair. Keanu exhaled, forcing himself to stay calm. "You don't have any family?" Mr. Alves shook his head. "My wife passed years ago. Never had kids. It's just me now." That hit Keanu harder than he expected. Just him. No one to check in. No one to make sure he was okay. No one to fight for him. Until now. Keanu cleared his throat. "And your knee?" The old man hesitated, then absently rubbed his leg. "Doctor says I need surgery." He chuckled, but there was no real humor in it. "But if I take time off, I can't pay my bills, so I keep going." Keanu's fingers curled into fists. 80 years old, injured, no family, no safety net. And yet the man was still smiling, still acting like this was just the way things had to be. Keanu had seen injustice before. He had witnessed suffering. But this was personal, because once upon a time, when Keanu was just a lost kid wandering these same hallways, Mr. Alves had been there. Not in a loud, obvious way, but in the small moments, the quiet understanding, the way he had noticed Keanu when no one else did. And now Keanu saw him. His voice came out steady. "I want to help." Mr. Alves immediately shook his head. "I don't take handouts." Keanu expected that. He knew this wouldn't be easy. "Not a handout," Keanu said smoothly. "A job." That made the old man pause. Keanu continued. "You've spent your life helping kids in this school, making sure no one went unnoticed. That's not just something you did while cleaning floors, that's who you are." He tilted his head. "So what if I told you I need someone like that?" Mr. Alves frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Keanu pulled out his phone, tapping the screen a few times before showing it to the janitor. On the display was an email draft, a proposal for a mentorship program. Keanu's voice was calm, but firm. "This school doesn't just need a janitor. It needs someone who sees the kids slipping through the cracks, someone who can teach them about life, about resilience, about what it means to keep going." He held the phone up. "A mentorship program, run by you." Mr. Alves just stared. Keanu lowered the phone. "You wouldn't be cleaning floors anymore. You'd be guiding kids, talking to them, helping them the way you helped me." His lips quirked into a small smirk. "But to do that, you need to be in good shape, which means you need that surgery." The old man's fingers twitched slightly against the mop handle. Keanu leaned in slightly. "So it's not charity, Mr. Alves. It's a requirement for the job." Silence, then a quiet chuckle, a shake of the head. "You always were a stubborn kid." Keanu smirked. "Learned from the best." For the first time, Mr. Alves didn't look tired. He looked considering. Keanu had planted the seed. Now, he just had to make sure it grew. The school's fundraiser went by in a blur, smiling faces, polite conversations, applause at the right moments, but Keanu's mind was somewhere else. He wasn't here to shake hands with donors or give rehearsed speeches. He had a mission. The next morning, long before the students arrived, Keanu was already at the school. No cameras, no press, just him and a plan he wasn't willing to let fail. He found Mr. Alves in the janitor's closet, fixing the handle of an old broom with careful, practiced hands. "Back again?" The old man raised an eyebrow, amusement flickering across his face. "Told you." Keanu leaned against the doorframe. "I can't stay away." Mr. Alves smirked, shaking his head. "What's really on your mind, kid?" Keanu took a deep breath. No games this time. "You." Mr. Alves' hands stilled for just a second. Keanu didn't waste time. "Your knee's not getting better, and you know it. You need surgery, and I'm going to take care of it." The janitor immediately frowned, shaking his head. Keanu, Keanu held up a hand. I know. You don't take handouts. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a neatly folded piece of paper, placing it on the desk. Mr. Alves hesitated before picking it up. His eyes moved slowly across the page, lips parting slightly as he read. Life Lessons with Mr. Alves, a mentorship program. Keanu crossed his arms. You're not retiring. You're stepping into something bigger. The school needs you, not as a janitor, but as a mentor. His voice softened. Kids need someone who understands what it's like to feel invisible, someone who can teach them about resilience, about real life. That's you, Mr. Alves' silence filled the tiny room. Mr. Alves traced the words on the paper with his calloused fingers. And if I say no? Keanu shrugged, flashing a playful grin. Then I'll just keep coming back until you say yes. A long pause, then a chuckle, a shake of the head. You always were a stubborn one. Keanu smirked, learned from the best. Mr. Alves let out a slow exhale, looking down at the paper again. His fingers gripped the edges as if weighing its worth, and then finally he sighed. Guess I don't have a choice, huh? Keanu's grin widened. Nope. Within weeks, everything was set in motion. Mr. Alves underwent his knee surgery, the best doctors, the best care, and when he woke up groggy from anesthesia, Keanu was right there, arms crossed, smirking. Better heal fast, old man. The kids are waiting. Recovery wasn't easy. Mr. Alves wasn't the kind of man to sit still, and patience wasn't his strong suit. But Keanu made sure he had everything he needed, a comfortable place to rest, regular checkups, and the one thing the old man had gone without for too long, support. And when the day finally came for him to return to the school, it wasn't as a janitor. Keanu stood beside him as they walked through the halls, students passing by, unaware that something had changed forever. No mop, no bucket, just a man who had given his life to this place, finally stepping into a role he had unknowingly played for decades. The first session of the mentorship program was in a newly renovated classroom, chairs arranged in a circle. A few students sat awkwardly, unsure of what to expect. Mr. Alves took a slow breath, gripping his cane. Then he spoke. You know, he said, his voice steady, people think I just cleaned floors. But I saw everything. I saw kids who thought no one noticed them. I saw the ones who were fighting battles they didn't think anyone else could see. His eyes scanned the room, landing on each student. I see you. The room was silent. And just like that, he had them. Keanu leaned against the doorway, watching as the session unfolded. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't scripted, it was real. A small smirk played at his lips. It was exactly what he knew it would be. But his work wasn't done yet. A week later, Mr. Alves was standing in front of a brand new building on campus, a building he hadn't even known was being built. His name was carved into the sign above the entrance. The Alves Educational Center, a place for second chances. The old man turned to Keanu, his lips parting in disbelief. You didn't have to do this. Keanu nudged him lightly. No arguments. It's already built. Mr. Alves exhaled, shaking his head. You always were stubborn. Keanu smirked. Learned from the best. But Keanu had one final surprise left. Days later, the airport was bustling, people rushing past without a second glance. But in one quiet corner, Mr. Alves stood beside a small, worn suitcase, gripping the handle tightly. A ticket was tucked neatly into his pocket, for a flight to a place he hadn't been in nearly 40 years. Keanu stood beside him, hands in his pockets. You sure you're ready for this? The old man chuckled, his voice quieter. I spent my whole life making sure other people were okay. Maybe it's time I let someone take care of me for once. Keanu nodded. Your brother's going to be happy to see you. Mr. Alves swallowed hard. I hope so. A silence stretched between them. Then Mr. Alves turned, his expression softer than Keanu had ever seen it. You've done a lot for me, kid. But you know something? Keanu tilted his head. What's that? A small smile formed on the old man's lips. "You were always a good kid. I just helped you see it." Keanu felt a lump in his throat. The final boarding call echoed through the airport. Mr. Alves gripped Keanu's shoulder briefly, then picked up his suitcase. "See you around, kid." Keanu nodded. "See you around, old man." And with that, Mr. Alves disappeared through the gate, stepping into the next chapter of his life. Keanu exhaled, running a hand through his hair as he walked out of the airport. Reaching into his jacket, he pulled out an old, worn notebook, the one Mr. Alves had saved for over 40 years. Flipping to the last page, Keanu found the words he had written as a teenager. "If I ever make it, I hope I never forget what it feels like to be lost. And if I can, I'll help someone else find their way." A quiet chuckle escaped him, because now he knew he had never really been alone, and because of Mr. Alves, neither would the next generation of kids who walked through that school.